Once again, it's such a pleasure to be here. But more than that, to be looking at the subject of justice and righteousness. Now, one of the problems with justice is that everybody knows when we are treated unjustly. And sometimes we think it is a concept which has no origin. I remember reading somewhere that many years ago, malaria was treated mainly as something that was caused because of air or something like that, bad air. Then somebody found out that that was not the reason for malaria, and they started treating differently. So usually in world of theology, they use that as an example to talk about paradigm shift which took place. Now I think the reason we look at the scripture is the same reason. Because there are a lot of assumptions when it comes to a lot of things that happen around us, and especially when we talk about justice. Because we are always saying, what is justice? What is injustice? But it's very important to read the scripture, because all through, as I said, especially Old Testament, and as we move on to the New Testament, the image of God is somebody who is angry with injustice, because it violates the very good creation order that he had originally intended. That's why I wanted to look at it yesterday when Micah was talking to us about God being angry and coming down to respond to injustice. And we saw images of injustice. Micah is not the only one. You can read it all through in the prophets, because they actually give an explanation of how injustice looks like. This morning I was reading the book of Isaiah again, and it says that the rulers even had a tax on the people called straw tax. Now, it's interesting because when we look at our country, we have so much tax. And I was in Roxall last week, and they told me that the petrol for Nepal goes from India, and it is cheaper to buy petrol in Nepal across the border than in India. So some people cross, because here we have taxes. And interestingly, God looks at it as injustice, because it's actually affecting the people. And in the book of Isaiah it says, you even charge them straw tax. I don't know what straw tax was, because we don't have it. But I'm sure God was angry, because that was perhaps the little livelihood that the people had, because they collected straw. You can't eat straw. Maybe to feed their cattle or for burning. But even that was taxed. And God noticed. And so sometimes when we live in middle class situations, like I do, we may not feel the pain sometimes. And somebody, when petrol prices were going up, they said, but it's only 40 rupees which has gone up, because you eat for 40 rupees. Now that was the logic behind charging people. But I think when we read the scripture, there is no confusion in the mind of God as to what is injustice. And also there is no confusion in the mind of God as to who creates it. And that's very important for us. Because as people in the health sector, you don't treat the symptoms, you want to find the cause. Because you can't say, people, when I go to a doctor, and I have only one doctor I go to apart from Jesus, I think. Otherwise you think I go only to Jesus. And I tell him, and he usually asks me for symptoms. And he says, and what about your appetite? Do you have fever? But he doesn't treat the symptom, because he wants to find what is the cause. And injustice is like that. Because when God gets angry and he comes down to act against injustice, he actually acts against people. He acts against systems. He overthrows kingdoms. He brings down rulers. Which means in some way or other, there are people who are part of the system that perpetuates injustice. Sometimes it could be parents also. Amartya Sen, in his brilliant book, which came out 4 years ago, called The Idea of Justice, says the first value a child is concerned about is not love, but justice. For those of us who have children, you would know, when they'll come to you and say, Daddy, that's not fair. Interestingly, they're not saying you don't love me. They say that's not fair. Because you do something for a child and you don't do it for the other child, the first value, Amartya Sen says, that the child is conscious about is the value of justice. And I think when you travel around this country, there is a feeling. I told you last week, 2 weeks ago, I was in a Beale area and talking to the tribals, hardly anything around the place. The government has put water in hand pumps for them, but still there is no water. So I asked them, why is there's no water? They said there's nobody here to come and repair the hand pump. And it's been 3 years since the hand pump has been installed and there is no mechanic. And when we go to the government, they'll say they'll send somebody, and like Dr. David said yesterday, they'll send somebody and the somebody doesn't come. And what happens? Because of which there is no access to water. And when I was asking them, they were clear as to who are the reasons for injustice. And they said, we would like one day, one older man said, I asked them, what is your dream for your community? He said, one day, I'm hoping that the Beals will be the school teachers for the schools in which our children go. I said, why? They said, because our children go to schools where the teacher does not give time for them because they are Beals and they are from another tribe. And so these people are from another caste. And so they actually invest in their people. And they know injustice is perpetuated by systems, by people. And I think it's important for us to know what God sees. Because when God comes to act against injustice, he just doesn't go around the earth with a wand in his hand and then say, let there be justice. That's what he did when he created the world. When he said, let there be. But when God comes to create a new world in which there is justice, it includes the punishment of people and institutions that have perpetuated injustice. And we must look at that. Because sometimes we have this good feeling that injustice and justice are concepts. I remember being at a world religious conference where I was doing the keynote address on religion and development. And there were people from different religions in the group. And during one of the sessions, the NGO group was using the words that we need to fight against those who are oppressors, those who are the unjust ones. And I was surprised. I didn't know then. All the other religious groups came together and said, that kind of words you shouldn't use because you will alienate people from people. There are no oppressors and there are no oppressed. They said that's a wrong language. So somebody asked them, then what about those who are the poor? He said they are not at where they should be because they are not enlightened. And I said, we have not moved very far. We still continue to blame the victims of injustice for their condition of injustice. But the Bible doesn't talk that way. God is upset with those who perpetuate injustice. And so today, I want to look at who are the ones who perpetuate injustice so that we know. Already I have heard from many of the reports. You have so beautifully identified so many places where you work. Maybe you didn't call them instruments of injustice or you didn't call people, oppressors. But perhaps that is the politically right thing to do in these days. But the Bible uses words. Somebody asked me, I think it was Sadevi, today in the morning session, he said, I need to talk to CB about the poor. And I remember in one of the times that I came here earlier, that same question was asked to me in the auditorium as to, who are the poor? The Bible uses the word. Definitely, when the Bible uses the word poor, it is not using it the way we understand poor. Because always when we say we saw a lot of poor people there, we are talking of homeless people who are sitting on the streets, perhaps with hardly any clothes on and hardly any food, and malnourished children. That's the image we have of poor. But the Bible, interestingly, doesn't use the word poor that way. It uses one of those words. There are 5 words for the poor in the Bible. In the Old Testament, when it talks about the poor, there are 5 words. And when we say God has sent us out to bring good news to the poor, Jesus used one of those 5 words. But there are 5 words for the poor. Let me quickly tell you what it is so that you know. Because often these days we say we work among the poor and we don't work with the large number of people who Jesus worked with. And what are the 5 words? One word in Hebrew is that those who are lacking something, even lacking wisdom, that same word is used. Those who lack. So that's why we say they lack clothes, they lack food, they lack shelter, they don't have it. That's one word for poor. A second word for poor are those who are dependent on others. That means even though they may not be in a place where they are economically, under a system where they don't have food, but they cannot stand on their feet. Sometimes I think development organizations thrive with such people because if they are able to be independent, the development organization will have to stop work. So we like to keep the poor so that we can continue in our job. Now that is the second word that is used. Those who are constantly dependent on others. That's why in the last 30 years, in the field of development, people moved from welfare to community organization to economic empowerment. Because unless you are able to make people stand on their feet, they are continuously going to be poor. The third word that is used in the Old Testament is the word frail. Those who are frail, which means those who are physically incapable of responding. It could be aged people, it could be children, it could be people who are disabled. And very important category, because often when we work with the poor, we forget these groups, especially, the senior citizens, the aged people, and those who are disabled. Then the fourth word, which is used for the poor, are those who are dispossessed. Those whose land has been taken away and they are suddenly poor. And I talked about it yesterday when it says you defrauded the poor and took away their land. So that is the fourth word for the poor. So when you are in Vellore or any place when you go, you may find people still living in a slum, but having a television sometimes and having perhaps a scooter. And it's easy for you to think that they are not poor. But if you talk to them, they will say, actually we had a land somewhere. And we were farmers before. And then what happened is the government decided to give our land to somebody else, perhaps a steel making company. And we were thrown out. We were fishermen, a trade which for 500 years we have been doing. But now we cannot go to the sea because the sea has been affected. And so what do we do now? We have to learn a new skill. And so we are dispossessed. And now we are sitting in the streets learning how to do tailoring project. Now the Bible would say they are poor. But the word which is used most often in the Bible is the Hebrew word anahu, which means those who are oppressed. And that is what Jesus used when in Isaiah 61, he opened the passage and said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor. Now, of course, there is another meaning to the same word, but it's a similar word. And very important. So when God looks at the poor in India, you may say they are economically better off. India has now crossed the line where we have less poor than maybe 16 years ago. That's what the World Development Index said. But the condition is that not that they don't have food now, but there are many people who are still oppressed. In fact, large number of people are entering that category of oppressed and exploited and cheated. And so when we look at the word poor, it's very important to know when God acts, He's not doing a charity work. That's why Chrysostom, one of the early church fathers, said, when you give to the poor, it's not charity, it is justice. because you give back to the poor what originally belonged to them. What a fantastic statement. Archbishop Romero from Latin America, Southern America said, when I give to the poor, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor are poor, they call me a communist. Interesting. And when you look at the scripture, when God looks at injustice, he pains his heart. Not because the poor have no food, definitely it does. It pains his heart, not because there are people who are frail, who nobody cares for. It does pain his heart, but it definitely pains his heart because people oppress one another. People exploit one another. Now, who are the culprits? So when you read the prophets, it's interesting. When God acts, he is so angry about injustice. And it doesn't matter whether they know Yahweh or not. Especially in our country, India, we must remember this. Because very often we hear people say, but we are only 2% of the population, maybe 3%. But we are a minority. So what? If you're a minority, it doesn't mean that the God of the Bible is not the God of this universe. And that's why when the prophet Amos was called, God told him to go. Yes, he had to go to Israel. He had to go to Judah. But before that, he had to go to other nations. For 3 sins of Damascus, I will punish them. For 4 sins, what does God say? I saw the way you ripped open pregnant women in order to spread your borders. I saw the way you killed people during wartime. God goes on. And now they can look at God and say, hey, but Yahweh is not our God. But it doesn't matter whether Yahweh is your God or not. Because sometimes Christians are quiet because they say, but, we are a minority. But this is the character of God we are talking about. We are talking about the character of God. So the prophets were sent with the message. Nineveh, for instance, had something they done which came to the ears of God, and God was upset about it. And so he sent Jonah. And what happened is Jonah went there. Of course, he knew that the God of the Bible is also a compassionate God. But many times we are scared to talk about justice. We are scared to confront injustice because we say that this country is not a Christian nation. And when you're a Christian nation, it is worse. I remember listening to an African preacher 3 weeks ago in a conference. And he was telling us about how in this country, which is 100% Christian, there's a lot of corruption in the country. And some of the Christian leaders were very concerned. They went and met the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister gave them an audience and they complained. They told him how they are so concerned about the corruption in the country. And the Prime Minister looked at them and said, they are with you the whole of Sunday. And Monday to Saturday they are in the government. This is the same people. And I think when we travel around the country, especially Northeast India, many places, you will find the church is the most corrupt institution. Not the church, the Christians. Somebody in 2008, there was a survey done. Not a survey done, there were 2 interesting reports which came out. Transparency International, which had a report on the most corrupt nations in the world. They usually do that annually. But on a map, they had plotted in different colors, the least corrupt and the most corrupt. But almost same time, there was another study done by somebody else, some other organization, on the most religious countries in the world. And they too had plotted, unaware of each other's research. But someone noticed that if you put one map over the other, the most corrupt and the most religious are the same countries. Interesting, isn't it? The most corrupt and the most religious are the same. It's not that religion causes corruption, but religion somehow has a way to make us look at things differently, not from the way God looks at. And that is why one of the institutions that God is upset about, especially when it comes to Judah and Israel, is the religious institutions. And God is very angry with religious institutions. You must remember, by the time Isaiah and others had come, it had been many years since Moses received the law. And in the beginning years, Israel had judges. And the judges had actually The judges actually were responsible to ensure that the law of God was kept. Thank you. The judges had one responsibility, to ensure that the law was kept. And they helped the people to win wars, but they were not permanent. Then Samuel was the last of the judges. And the people of Israel wanted a king. And it's very interesting when you look at the conversation between Samuel and the people. They wanted a king who will lead them. But God was upset. Not that they rejected God, but they said they don't know what they are choosing. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God tells them what a king would do. And very interesting, God says, he would rule over you. When they wanted a king, they were looking for somebody who will lead them. But God says, when you choose a king, he will rule over you. All that is good in you, he will take it. Your land will belong to him, and your children will belong to him, and he will start taxing you. And then one day you will cry out, because the system you have chosen is a system that is going to oppress you. And God says, on that day I will not hear you. But God, being God, his heart was moved, and he gave them a king after his own heart. He gave David a king who ruled the people of Israel like God would shepherd them. And so what happens is that the institution that we have chosen, we have to be very suspicious. And not just any institution. I'm not talking about the government alone. The character of institution, if you don't watch, is that it can create inequality and it can create oppression. So especially when you're leading an institution, you have to always be alert that your institution, even though it may be doing a good vision and achieving something for God, can internally be an unjust institution. And we know many times it happens. I've met with people who work in Christian institutions, and Christian institutions about which I've heard, but they'll say, Brother CB, you don't know what's happening inside. There is so much of politics and so much of injustice. And we must remember that institutions have a character. So when God comes in, first thing is that he is upset with the religion. Because what had happened is, over the years, these people had come up with the way, I love the way Brother Rajkumar talked this morning. They were all doing the law, but not with the right heart. God says, with their lips, they talk about me, but their hearts are not for me. And so God is upset. And I want to look at a few religion activities that God is upset about. Because these days, we have a lot of these activities which perhaps, if you don't watch, can be meaningless. For instance, God is upset with them about their worship. Now, I think I am touching on a very, very, very delicate line. Because these days, worship has become entertainment. And it's nothing about God. I look at the words of some of the songs and say, did you read those words? And it's nothing wrong. People say, we had a lovely worship. What was lovely? We don't know what the words were, but we could tap our feet and sing. Interesting. Because God is very upset. If you look at the book of Jeremiah, book of Amos, this is what he says. In verse 21 of chapter 5. I hate. What a strong word. God uses strong words. I hate. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Oh my God. I look at it and say, I can picture Jesus. Every time where 2 or 3 are gathered, he made a promise he has to come. And I'm sure he's dragging his feet and coming because he says, actually, God, I don't want to go to that meeting. And the Father says, but you made a promise, go there. Because 2 or 3 are gathered. That's how it is. He says, your assemblies are a stench to me. You can picture Jesus arriving at some of our worship time and having a mask over his face. Because he says, you don't know, I can get the stink. He says, even though you bring me burnt offering and grain offering, I will not accept them. God, years ago, I spoke in the church where I go to, Brother Raj and I go to the same church. I took a session on our God is a fussy God. He's got very particular tastes. In the book of Malachi, he says, I don't want your offering. Here he says, I don't like your worship. He says, though you bring choice fellowship offering, I have no regard for them. Then verse 23, away with the noise of your songs. We thought it was good music. God says it is noise. I was sitting in the front row yesterday, and Brother Tony said, are you comfortable sitting here? Because the sound will be so loud. It is loud, but that is not the problem. God was not talking about the loudness. He talks about something which has no sense of music in it. He says, your worship is like that. I remember my young son, when he was younger, was very much into heavy metal rock. Now, those of you who know anything about heavy metal rock, it's something when you want to practice, you have to close the doors and the windows of the house. It's so loud. So I had to always tell him, keep the door closed, because it was so loud. And I also, not all of us love the same music. And when you ask God, what kind of music do you like? And it says here, let justice roll like a river. He says, I will not listen to the music of your harps. Let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. God has a lot to say about worship. God says, when you gather for worship, He says, make sure that you are a people who are known for doing justice. And that is why He says in Isaiah 58, when people gathered for prayer meeting, and they fasted for so long. And they said, God, why are you not doing it? Why are you not responding? He said, is this the kind of fast that I have chosen? That one day in a year when all of you will come together and beat your chest? He said, that's not what I want. He said, the fast that I have chosen is to do justice, to release the oppressed. Interestingly, for God, that is the real life. That is the real life. It is not what we do on religious vocations of worship. And then He says, your prayer, He says in Isaiah, in the beginning, in chapter 1, He says, I will not hear your prayers because your hands have got blood in it. Now we really look at the Bible and says, God doesn't accept religion with all its rituals. He says, I don't want your offering. Take your offering back. He said, if I want, I can get an offering. The sheep, He says, the cattle on the hills belong to Him. He says, I don't need your offering. Very strong. In the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 7, what happens is God tells Jeremiah to go and stand near the temple and tell the people, don't deceive yourself with foolish words, saying that this is the temple of God. God said, I will destroy it. God is not the caretaker of our institutions. When there is injustice, He will destroy the institution. He said, go to Shiloh and see. That is where I met before. Now there is only one small stone there. God says, I'm not going to maintain. In Jeremiah chapter 8, God says, don't say, we have the law with you. He says, you need to obey the law. Because sometimes we say, but we have the Bible. You don't know. We are from the CSI tradition. Or I come from the Methodist tradition. We are very proud, even though we don't know what tradition we have. But interestingly, we all talk about our histories. And God says, I will destroy you when there is injustice. And very important for us, because I believe one of the biggest stumbling blocks to doing justice is religion itself. No wonder Karl Marx said, religion is the opiate of the people. It has a way to soften the pain of injustice and tell people, don't worry, God is on your side. But God is angry with religion. He says, I don't like your worship. I hate your gathering. I don't want to listen to your prayers. When you sing, it is like noise to me. I don't want your fasting. This is not the kind of fasting that I've chosen. And I believe that we in our country should take seriously the teaching of justice in the context of worship, especially these days, because worship has become injustice a lot of times. The songs and the worship people, I've been to a place where there was a great worship team, but afterwards, when they came down from where they worshipped and they were walking, somebody who was poorer person tried to go to them. They wouldn't talk to the poor people. They will talk to the people who were well-to-do people. That is what they're friends. My friends, if your worship team is something that cannot be friends with those who have the pain of injustice, you do not have the heart of God. How often, whenever I used to go to Calcutta, one of my regular stops was to visit Mother Teresa in her home. And when I met that lady, I always said, here is someone who was located among those who were the oppressed. And my prayer is that we will do that. A second group that God is upset about, I'll quickly go on, are people, leaders, all through the scriptures. He's upset. When he talks about injustice, he says about rulers. Rulers are oppressors. Not to say all rulers are, but if you look at the kings in the Old Testament, there are 28 kings in the Old Testament, and most of them did not please God. That's a sad history of leadership. Leadership doesn't produce people who actually are conscious of the character of God. Because that's where we need to hold each other accountable. In the book of Micah, it says in chapter 3, you should embrace justice. How often can we access our leaders and talk to them about justice? We can't do this in our country. We can't do it in many other countries. We can talk and appreciate them for all that they're doing. But to go to a ruler, like Nathan went and told David, in your nation, there was a poor man who had only one lamb. And there was a rich man next door. And he had a guest at home, so he wanted to have a feast. So he went to the poor man and told him, can you give this lamb? And the poor man said, this is the only one that I have. But the rich man took it. And when he told the story to David, you see what happened in the Bible. David gets angry. He said, tell me who is the man in my kingdom who treated somebody unjustly. Today you go tell a leader, brother, in your organization there's injustice. They said, you mind your own business. That's not your area. But Nathan went and told him, this is happening in your kingdom. Somebody took off the lamb of a poor man. David was furious. And he said, who is the man? Nathan looked at him and said, you are the man. You took someone else's wife. And he said, I have sinned against God. My friends, there was such anger when he heard about injustice in his midst. We need to have leaders like that. Kings who will embrace justice. Kings who will talk about their annual report in which they will say how we brought justice in our communities. Today it is about activities. But when God calls the rulers together, it says in Psalm 82, he will ask them whether they spoke on behalf of the rights of the poor. That is what God will do. Charles Malik was a United Nations Secretary General, a Christian from Lebanon. And one morning when he was reading the scripture, he writes in his diary, he came across Psalm 82. When it says, all the nations of the world, all the gods of the world, it says, will gather before God, and God will ask them about maintaining just rights of the poor. Charles Malik was touched by the Holy Spirit. So what he did was, he started pushing in the United Nations what today is called UN Human Rights, Charter. He came with that because of Psalm 82. Because it says that Psalm 82 says God will hold all leaders accountable for maintaining the rights of the poor. And not just political leaders, religious leaders, priests, prophets. And that's what happens. So when God punishes them, he says, I will throw you out. I will bring the rulers down. I will throw the priests out. The prophets, I will ridicule them. Remember, when justice has to be dealt with, injustice has to be dealt with, it's real people. And then the last group are the ordinary people like us. And we must remember, unconsciously, we sometimes are not sometimes, most times, part of injustice. And we have to be very watchful. When you travel around the world, they will always take you to shops where you get shirts which are made in Bangladesh. I remember going with my brother-in-law, and he said, why don't you buy a shirt? I said, look at me. It's been a long time since I wore a shirt. But anyway, he insisted I'll take a shirt for my brother, for my son. I looked at it, and it's made in Bangladesh. And I said, why would I come all the way from India to buy a shirt in the US made in Bangladesh? But then the whole issue is Bangladesh produces cheap shirts because workers are kept in a room. I went and saw a room which is 1/3 of the size, which has nearly 300 workers living in inhuman conditions. No wonder the price is low. We go to the shop and we buy a shirt and say, wow, this is very good. It's cheap. But how does cheap shirt come? It comes because somebody is exploiting somebody. But we are looking for it. In the whole world, where there's so much where you can be a part of injustice if you don't ask the right questions. And God is upset. And in the book of Amos, he says about the women of Bashan. This is not the words which I would like to use, but this is what God says. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. Because it's not that the women were oppressing the poor, but they had a lifestyle which was putting pressure on their husbands to exploit people. Remember, our lifestyle sometimes can be that which perpetuates oppression. How often it happens around the world. It's a lifestyle. In the Christian understanding, we have a strong teaching on how to make money. That is a lot of teaching. There are certain things you can't do as a Christian, for making money. And then there is also a good teaching on how to give money. 1/10 to God, or if you go to another church, maybe you give more, but whatever it is. But I think today we need a theology of consumption. We need a theology of consumption. Because we think, the rest of the money is ours. How often I find young people with phones, mobile phones, nothing wrong in having a smartphone. And I ask them, hey, last week you had another phone, what happened? Recently, one of our young people had a new phone. I said, how much is the phone? She said, 50,000. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I wouldn't spend 50,000 on a phone. But she said, uncle, it's got a good camera. So what? To take a selfie? That's all she does. And we need to say, is that consistent with the follower of Jesus Christ? Is there a theology of consumption which says enough is enough? Because you can have the capacity as people who are in medical services to generate income, it doesn't mean your lifestyle should also be like that. There are a lot of people in this country who find it hard to have 2 meals. And God says, you cows of Bashan, you oppress the poor because of your lifestyle. And then he goes on to say in Amos, in the next chapter, chapter 6, he says, woe to you who are complacent in Zion. To you who feel secure, who are so indifferent to what happens in a nation like India, when there are people who have lost their own relatives and can't find them. When somebody is killed for lynching and the person who lynched the person is getting a ticket to stand for election. And people say, oh, where is it happening? And I look at them and say, where were you all these years? Are you just coming back to India from somewhere? They say, no, we were here. We don't read. God says, woe to you who are complacent, to you who feel secure, you notable men of the foremost nation, to whom the people of Israel come. And he says, you put off the day of disaster. You lie on beds adorned with ivory, and you lounge on your couches. You dine on choice lambs, and you strum away on your harps like David, and you improvise on musical instruments. Man, I can almost picture when the whole country is burning, God is talking about a group of young people who have got the latest headphone and don't know what's happening around. And they got a guitar in their hand and they're singing to God. God says there's fire outside. Enough. He says, you who are complacent. God says, you therefore will be among the first that I will punish. Ignorance is no bliss. Indifference is not a virtue. And lifestyle has to be watched. Because when there is injustice, it breaks the heart of God. And it's very important for us to know there are actual people. There are rulers, there are priests, there are prophets, there are indifferent people, there are people who think they have a right to have a lifestyle which gives them 130 rooms in one house in India. And we say, but isn't there any justice in that? And we say, no, that is not, he's got money. We say, no, that is injustice. Very important to have images, because when God punishes, he punishes. And that's why I think we need to be very cautious that one of the things that blinds us to the things that break the heart of God is religion itself. 2 years ago, I'll stop now, my brother-in-law passed away. and he was in Chennai, and he had a stroke. And I still remember, of course, a death is always remembered. I remember something that happened there. I had come down from Chennai, and the body was in the mortuary, and they said the body will come at 3 o'clock. And after I met my sister and my brothers had come down, and after the initial breaking down and crying, we were talking. And the children, my sister has got small children, grandchildren, and they were all playing outside. And occasionally they'll run inside the drawing room, making noise and saying, he's fighting with me, she's fighting with me. And then they try and bring peace. This went on till about 3 o'clock when the body came. And when the body was brought in, it was in the drawing room. And all the crying was happening. And my children, my grandchildren, her grandchildren were still playing outside. They used to come inside. They're very small at that time, 5, 3 and all. And they will come inside. But then I noticed something. This time it was different. They'll be very quiet when they come in. Not because there was a coffin. Because they will notice that their grandmother is crying. They will notice that their mother was crying. They will notice that their uncles were broken. And they'll notice the tears there. And they'll walk in very quiet. And I think many times in our worship, we don't lift our heads to look at the face of God. Because if you see the face of God, you will see tears rolling down. I think most of our worship, we end up by looking at the feet of God. Lift your heads, look at the face of God. You will see tears rolling down. A student in a university who was killed because he didn't get his scholarship. Another student went missing, not yet found. Police can't find him. Families whose children have been sold in Bihar, in this place when I was in Beal. I asked them, where are all your young people? These people have not moved out of that place. They said, Saab, bahar gaya. They've gone outside. I said, where have they gone? Madras, Hyderabad, Bangalore. They knew the map of India. I said, who took them there? They said, Pata nahi sahab, one man came here and he said, I'll get you jobs. Human trafficking in our country, sexual abuse. Does it break your heart? It would. Because when you go to worship God, Isaiah said, I heard a voice saying, who will go for me? Who will go for me? I think most of our worship is entertainment for ourselves. We feel good. But true worship is for God, because Bible, Jesus said, God seeks worshippers. It's not that we seek worship. God seeks worshippers. And my concern today is that the group which is least interested in justice are those who are high on worship, prayer, fasting, and prayer meeting. I think it should turn, because justice is the right, worship is the right of a broken people. Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. Worship is the right of those who hunger for righteousness and thirst for righteousness. That's the right. May God enable us to be such a people. Amen.